Hi, and welcome to Ones and Twos, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you this week from Washington. Joining us, as always, is Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, this week in Beijing. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, this week we are continuing a mini-series, or continuing an intermittent mini-series that we do on Heterodox Economists. Last week, we addressed John Kenneth Galbraith. You can look that up if you missed it. And this week, we want to continue with a look at Thorstein Veblen, the American economist. And I should note here before we go on that this happens to mark our 200th episode, which is, worth pointing out. Adam, congrats on 200 episodes. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great. It really has. It's been wonderful. What a journey.
So, to dive in, I want to start by asking what I usually ask when we do these Heterodox Economist segments, namely with a question about Veblen's biography and how that may have shaped his ideas. I mean, generally, who was he? What shaped his economic worldview? And I was interested in this specifically because I noticed, on one hand, he was a kind of itinerant academic, but he also seemed to be pretty popular in his own day. So yeah, how did those biographical facts fit together?
Yeah, the more we've done these episodes on the Heterodox Economists, the more I've become conscious of the importance of just really banal things like date of birth. And Veblen is, and I'm going to go in with you on the uncertainty of how we best pronounce him. I think it's Thorstein in the original Norwegian, but I think most people know him as Thorsten, right? Anyway, Veblen, born 1857, and only just born in the US. So 1857 means he's, a generation earlier than the oldest person we've dealt with so far, who was Keynes. Let alone, from a different era altogether than the folks that are born after 1900. He's really a Victorian figure, only just born in the US because his family's from Norway. They lived in a largely Norwegian enclave in the American Midwest, which is where he grew up. And the significance of this, I think, is that, and it goes directly to your question about his subsequent careers, that absolutely everything is in flux. I mean, including what it means to be an American, because the US in 1857 really is, especially the Midwest, is radically driven by new arrivals, by immigrant settlers, right? But also what the US Academy is. He earned one of the first dozen or so PhDs. His first PhD was in philosophy. And what economics is really up for grabs as an academic discipline in the mid-19th century. One of the things we're going to be thinking about is his relationship to standard neoclassical economics, which doesn't exist at the moment that he's born, right? So he's really a figure from before the era in which being heterodox really made a great deal of sense, because to be heterodox, there has to be an orthodoxy. And when Veblen is born, there's no such thing really in terms of academic economics. There are more or less important economists, more or less dominant figures, people who are calling themselves economists, but there isn't, his major influence at Carleton College in Minnesota was John Bates Clark, who is one of the founding figures of neoclassical economics, the belief that, the idea being that the wages adjust to the marginal utility of the worker, that interest rates and reflect a similar return to capital, but would have identified himself as I believe, a Christian socialist at the time. So the alignment of neoclassical economics with conservatist politics is not yet a given. The sorts of concerns that shaped Veblen as he was growing up and entering academic life were those of the 19th century, in that they were really, the central divide was between people of faith and those without faith, and agnostics, let alone atheists, were very much on the outside of conventional academic life in the last third of the 19th century. And Darwinianism is really the central intellectual preoccupation of the age. And Veblen, in his student years, was very heavily influenced by the social Darwinist, social evolutionary thinking of somebody like Herbert Spencer. So in all of these ways, this is a man, very far away from Joan Robinson, who's, visiting Maoist China in the post-war period, or Kalecki. We're really in a very different universe. He has an extraordinary itinerant career, as you say. He never really settles down into America's emerging university system. He bounces around from Carleton to the newly founded Johns Hopkins, and from there to Yale, and then to a gig at Cornell, which then takes him to Chicago, where he writes his most influential book, say on the leisure class, but then drifts into government work, working with the Wilson administration, and then becomes one of the founding. I mean, his most lucrative academic position was as one of the founding members of the group that created the New School in New York, which was a dissident university of progressive thought, specifically designed to break out of the confines of an academic system that was still very much shaped by, on the one hand, business influence. Johns Hopkins was founded by railway money, and on the other hand, by religion and the constraints of conservative religion. And you could run into problems both ways. You could run into problems for your socialism, for your atheism. Veblen's career was marred by allegations of infidelity to both his wives, I think. He was married twice. And that in turn earned him the suspicion of conservative opinion. And in the end, also, your position on the war, World War One, could become quite a decisive thing in an American academic career in the early 20th century. So he's a figure from this earlier age, and that, I think, helps also explain the fluidity of his trajectory, which starts in philosophy, though with some background in economics, which was not by any means at that point clearly distinguished from philosophy, and then back into economics. But his economics always has the feel about it, really, of a social theory, of history, of a broader evolutionary theory, of sociology, we might say. Again, a discipline which was only beginning to take shape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So he's a figure, really, of the transition period, and nevertheless one whose specific theories, I think, speak very loudly to us in the present. A very truly fascinating person to dig into their biography.
Yeah, and I think fascinating, as you say, precisely for the reason that economics hadn't quite consolidated as a discipline at the time that he was studying, and in some sense, it makes sense that he went to study philosophy. Actually, he overlapped with John Dewey, which somehow also seemed plausible to me when he was at Yale. But clearly, then Veblen had his interest in economics, which he then went on to pursue. And you mentioned the book, his first book, which earned a lot of attention, The Theory of the Leisure Class, which listeners may or may not have heard of, but if they haven't heard of it, they may have heard of the phrase that emerged from that book, conspicuous consumption, which Veblen coined and has now become a kind of common phrase of its own. And as you mentioned, it sort of sounds like a term of sociology, but maybe you could sort of clarify the economic insight, the content of that phrase, conspicuous consumption. It seems to sort of suggest that wealth in some ways and the spending of it isn't always rational. And I'm curious how that lines up with, our sort of more standard economic theory, the sort of neoclassical analysis of value, or even sort of more, I guess, contemporary theories of signaling, where kind of, any kind of spending, where even the cost of spending itself represents value. It seems like Veblen has a different insight in terms of what wealth and spending could mean. So, could you unpack that for us?
Yes, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head when you say this sounds sociological, because I think the claim is, and it's I think an immediately plausible claim, is that the rationality of much spending lies in the social significance, the signal that you send, and the way in which you relationally position yourself through that spending in the context of other people's choices, right? So it's banal, but really quite destabilizing to certain sorts of models of consumption. If you think about the purchase of cars, I'm in China right now, so it's fascinating to see the which people here navigate the whole new space of electric vehicles and so on. Like, you could simply buy the cheapest car for the purpose of getting yourself from A to B. But as we well know, an entire industry is built on the fact that people don't. People distinguish themselves from each other by buying a huge array of finely differentiated vehicles, some of which cost multiples of the cheaper models. And this is driven by a logic of distinction. And so within economics, there is now a class of commodities or goods called Veblen goods, for which demand goes up as their price increases, because by way of the price, the exclusivity, you signal to your surroundings that you are different, that you are better, that you are wealthier, that you're richer. So this is, it's certainly a logic, it's certainly a rationality. It's just not the rationality of a simple maximization of whatever utility you derive from driving a car or wearing clothes. It's a maximizing utility by way of the comparison with other people. But this being Veblen, and this being the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and this not being the principal target of this, not simply being conventional economics, which was only beginning to be conventional economics, this whole thing is in fact embedded in Veblen in a sweeping philosophical anthropology, like a history of humankind, going all the way back to the Neolithic as they understood it at the time, which is basically to say that throughout human history, folks have differentiated themselves in terms of the degree to which they needed to work. So there is also a concept in Veblen of conspicuous leisure, and the degree to which their consumption was constrained by mundane considerations of staying warm or having shelter or needing something to eat. And right from the very beginning of human society, Veblen argued that basically societies had differentiated profoundly along the lines of those for whom the compelling logic was, I need to work to eat, and those who conspicuously didn't work and then went on to waste food, or didn't work and went on to dress in absurdly grandiose and excessive ways. There's also in common between him and other contemporary economists like Werner Sombart, for instance, the idea that this has a major gendered component. So, in a gender-divided society, the central body, literally, on which conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure was displayed was the body of and the lives of upper-class women who were demonstratively removed from the processes of social reproduction beyond bearing children for, and ideally male heirs to the elite, and instead became essentially clothes hangers and means of displaying fine jewelry in extraordinarily excessive and incredibly cumbersome and impractical garments. And both Sombart and Veblen developed theories around the gender division of labor as being a central driver of modernity. What's also often ignored, and we will no doubt come back to this point, is that the ultimate form of conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure is not just not to work, but to involve yourself in destruction, to involve yourself in high-risk, belligerent, predatory behavior. So this is the sort of distinction we also see in somebody like Schumpeter between the bourgeois classes and the working class, who are about the practical business of reproducing society, and the aristocratic class that is preoccupied with a bunch of other things, notably, say, notions of honor or other types of social distinction. You could take this all the way back to Hegel in the master-slave dialectic, where, the master emerges because it's almost always thought of as he is the one that's willing to sacrifice bare life for distinction, and those who work are those who accept the reverse side of that bargain and subordinate themselves. And so I think this is also working its way through Veblen's idea of conspicuous consumption. It's not just a wrinkle in standard neoclassical consumer economics where the particular type of goods, the demand goes up when price goes up. It's an entire theory of what ultimately drives society and the perverse impulses that sit within modern societies, where as they become richer, the effect is in fact in many ways to increase these tendencies within society towards other types of logic asserting themselves over and above the productive logic of increasing productivity and output.
Yeah, that's all very helpful. I mean, and it does seem to me that this anthropological framework you're describing is really central to Veblen's analysis, because, yeah, it strikes me as inseparable from a kind of moral analysis that he's applying in analyzing this kind of consumption. And that's a distinction from the theories of signaling, it seems to me, where, it seems like contemporary theories are kind of morally neutral when they analyze spending to signal information. They kind of just take it at face value. But Veblen is sort of angered by it. You kind of sense this kind of, he's disturbed by kinds of consumption. And I think, that makes sense in this kind of sociological or anthropological framework. that, yeah, some consumption is kind of valueless for Veblen or destructive. And for me, that raises the question then, according to Veblen, what is the actual source of value? He has this kind of distinction between types of spending that are productive. He describes proper investment as productive versus some kinds of what we would think of, I guess, nominally as investment. He describes some types as purely pecuniary, is his term. And, according to his framework here, how can we tell those different kinds of investments apart?
Yeah, this is again a big 19th century preoccupation. You see something similar also in Marxism, after all, where there is an effort to distill out the core of what the productivity of the system is, so that one can then distinguish between surplus value generating and surplus value redistributing elements of the economic system. And I think something similar is going on in Veblen. So, I think we probably shouldn't go too brain in the vat about this and overthink it. Like, productive things are what you would expect them to be. It's like making useful things and providing useful services and growing, doing agriculture and doing industry and building factories and building the productive system. He is a theorist preeminently, if you think about his dates. 1850s are the discovery of the productivity of industrialism. It's the great exhibition in Victorian London. He comes into his own as an adult in the heyday of what people call the Second Industrial Revolution. This is the miracle of steel making, of truly extensive railway systems, of the telegraph, of modern of Edison and the electrical engineering, of industrial chemistry, right? So before your eyes, the world is being radical changed. The combine harvester, like the mechanization of agriculture, that's the productive bit, right? And let's not get too fussy about trying to distinguish. That's clearly productive. It's totally changing the world. And then there are things which are predatory, pecuniary, and are largely about gouging some sort of margin out of that productive process. And you can, of course, get margin by making the productive process even more productive, and that's one way to go. And there's a class of people, the engineering class, devoted to that. And Veblen is fascinated by the emergence not just of engineers, but of consulting engineers, like sort of meta efficiency experts who travel around the economy and say, no, you could shave money here, like Taylor, for instance, who advocated the Taylorist system. But one can think of many other consultant engineers in this period. That's one way of going. And the other way is the pecuniary mechanism, which is basically various types of exploitative mechanism. And this is where the Norwegian thing kind of wraps back in, because at least one theory of Veblen's intellectual genesis is that in one of his crisis periods between his first PhD in philosophy, which was with Peirce, I think, to join up the dots to the pragmatism you were pointing to, and his shift into economics, he spent a lot of time translating one of the Viking sagas into English. And one, I think, plausible read of his biography is that this left a deep impression on him of a warrior class organized around mythic honor that wasn't productive, that was, broadly speaking, predatory. And, history is the victory of the productive over the predative, the predation. And that's really the kind of foundation of all of this. And one really shouldn't, I think, underestimate the extent to which Veblen is therefore like a Schumpeter, for instance, or like some other contemporaries of this period, like a Lenin or a Hobson, all of which are figures that we could come back to in this meta series at some point, like preoccupied with imperialism. What he's really worried about is the threat of war. And the ultimate form of predation, the ultimate form of pecuniary manipulation of the economy is to harness the resources of the nation state, ever more powerful in this period, enhanced by the industrialism, not towards some sort of global expansion of productive forces, but towards war for the purpose of imperialism and the capture of other people's resources and the industrial capacity. So those are the stakes here. And at one end of the spectrum, the second industrial revolution is clearly the productive breakthrough. And at the other end of the spectrum, I think war is ultimately what defines the most radically unproductive kinds of activity. But for him, that's an extreme version of the positive sum as opposed to this will be the zero sum logic as opposed to the positive sum logic of genuine productive activity and expansion.
Got it. I mean, I guess maybe just to clarify, I mean, I agree that this sort of distinction between productive investment versus pecuniary motivations are that distinction's intuitive in a lot of ways, but in contrast, I guess, to the orthodox economic perspective these days, I mean, it seems to me that, the kind of passive investments of capital are sort of intuitively described as productive in our contemporary economy. And that's something that, I mean, as far as I can tell, Veblen would just fundamentally disagree with. I mean, is that...
That's true. And somebody like Keynes would also have zero hesitation in making that distinction. Absolutely none. Like Keynes advocated for quite fierce regulation of short-term capital movement on the grounds that it was just basically speculative. Veblen as well, I completely agree with you, would have no hesitation. And it's not as though we've totally lost that language. It comes and goes in the modern period. If you think about the outrage at the corporate raiders of the 1980s and 1990s, the private equity firms that went in and broke up the big industrial conglomerates of the 50s and 60s. So this moral economy, some historians might call it, this moral economy shifts over time. And, you see it in the discourse around Boeing versus Airbus that we've spoken about on the show at different points, that the standard explanation for why Airbus can still make safe passenger aircraft, and we're just not sure whether Boeing can, is that Airbus is basically run by engineers and Boeing is not, or what used to be and is no longer, because it was taken over by number crunching, bean counting, financial market orientated managerial types. And so this distinction, though I agree, like formal technical economics is no longer willing to make this distinction, I think it retains its claim on our imagination. And that's because it makes sense, right? Like there clearly is a difference between the folks that engineer the financing of, say, microchip factories and the people who actually build the factory and operate the factory. Those are two really, they're both in their own ways, one could argue, necessary and important, but one's more unnecessary and important than the other to the making of chips.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back in a second to continue talking about Thorstein Veblen. So if we were to take this a step further, I mean, did Veblen have something we would call a positive program? I mean, what was his vision for how to encourage useful investment? I mean, did he have a vision for how, prices could be set to encourage investment of the kind he had in mind? And has any sort of program ever been tried before of the sort that Veblen may have been imagining?
Yeah, he absolutely did. In the Engineers and the Price System book from 1921, I mean, he comes across as a kind of technocratic Marx. Like, for him, it's just a matter of time before the self-evident inefficiency and grotesque diversion of resources produced by the pecuniary motive is overwhelmed by the new class of technocrats and engineers. And I mean, I think it's a quite self-conscious and deliberate substitution of the technocratic engineering class for the proletarian in Marx. And in some sense, I think it's a far more plausible social theory of the 20th century in the end, that the professional managerial technocratic groups are those that have historical agency, are in some sense profoundly necessary, whereas the working class, and this was always a question implicit in the Marxian theory, is like, how would it acquire the power? And it would be by various complicated mechanisms of self-empowerment through collective agency. Whereas if you just look at any modern organization, it's clear that the running of it in large part is in the hands of a group of engineers, bureaucrats, technocrats whose interests are not aligned necessarily with the people who own the business and however understand its basic logic. And so Veblen hymned the imminent demise of the owning class. He literally spoke in terms of an engineer's Soviet. He thought, I mean, this is a book written in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. He didn't think the Soviet example was an instance of the emergence of an engineering run industrialism, because he was writing in 21. This was well before Stalinism. And because he thought Russia, like most people did, was too primitive an organism to really be capable of this. But he sounds a lot like a German social democrat, like a Bernstein or somebody like that of the early 1920s, who's basically saying, no, the place where this is going to happen is in the most complex, most highly integrated, most already, if you like, socialized mechanism of production. And that'll be in the more sophisticated societies. And I think he absolutely expected a general staff of engineers to emerge that would take over. And he speaks in terms of generations as well. That, I mean, because as it were, this shift to a highly technologically driven industrialism is, after all, relatively recent, late 19th century, early 20th century. It's really the generation that are coming into their own in the interwar period who are going to be the bearers of this vision. And it's not an implausible thesis, after all, of what actually did happen by the 50s and 60s. If we look at Galbraith on the technostructure, that's essentially, or Berlin means, people like this writing about American corporate life, or the corporatists of various stripes in Europe, actually all kind of converge with Veblen on this thesis. And you could see, I mean, there's a German argument about the same thing in German business economics, but there's the struggle between accountants and engineers, both of whom have their own rationality, and both of whom, I think, actually, by Veblen, would have been counted amongst the engineering class, because the accountants per se are not, theirs is a technology of rationalizing resource. That's not a purely pecuniary motive. It's actually streamlining the productive process using statistical and accounting techniques. So yeah, this is not an armchair theory. This is really quite, the engineers in the price system book is positively militant in its tone.
I guess to wrap up this conversation, I'd be curious to ask about Veblen's relationship to American universities. Obviously, yeah, as we mentioned at the outset, he had, on one hand, a successful academic career, but his relationship to universities was strained. He ended up moving among several of them, and he did actually write about the American university and offered a critique. And I'm curious, from Veblen's perspective, how would he understand or analyze what scholarship is in the context of the U.S. university? I mean, is it, to use the terms that we've been using, I mean, is it productive investment? Is it a kind of pecuniary extravagance? Is it something else entirely? I mean, how do we understand the work that's happening at American universities?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and one that's quite topical in the current moment. But again, I think it's important to be historically clear, right, that this is somebody who, born in the mid-19th century, encounters the American university really in its earliest stages. We did a show about Michigan and so on. Like the 19th century American university is not what it will become in the 20th century. Its central questions are actually theological. They're about Darwin. They're about the requirement on faculty to commit themselves to one or other strand of Christian teaching, essentially. And then in the late 19th century, American big business becomes involved. And with the rise of socialism, American big business becomes deeply interested in policing the boundaries of what could go on in universities. We're not yet at the stage of the California system modeled mechanism of the Cold War research university. That's in the future. This isn't Veblen's world. And Veblen, as part of the group that backs the New School, is in the business of creating a new model of university. But yeah, it's the subtitle of his 1918 study that really gives the game away, what his beef was. So it's called the Higher Learning in America, a memorandum on the conduct of universities by businessmen. I mean, there's the agenda, right? So this is an attack on the commercialization of education, first and foremost. So it's an attack on the subordination of universities. Before there was large-scale public funding, the subordination of universities to business interests. So he saw administrators and trustees as increasingly dominated by business values. It's a attack on what he called the captains of erudition, which are the CEO educators, so the university presidents and administrators who are in it for the institutional prestige, the branding, the fundraising, and so on. It's a critique of certain types of rather banal practical knowledge per se, so technical vocational education as opposed to pure science and liberal arts, which are the true core. This is not because Veblen had, despised in any way engineering, but he saw it as the role of the universities to promote a broader range and a deeper form of knowledge. It was a critique also of, marketable utilitarian forms of education, not just knowledge, but of education. Veblen was, though he was a highly popular author, as you said at the start, apparently a terribly dry, fiercely conservative and boring teacher. So he kind of lived his principles in the classroom. And then finally, and really cuttingly also for the present moment, it wraps round to his idea of conspicuous consumption. So the university is itself, and this is after all, crushingly confirmed by the history of American education in the 20th century, itself a highly conspicuous form of consumption. It's a dramatic demonstration of the willingness of American families to invest in more and more exclusive, more and more expensive social differentiation by way of the acquisition of university titles and degrees. So it's a remarkably consistent body of thought, Veblen's actually. I was impressed engaging with it for the show this week by the coherence and the modernity, the relevance of this vision, in which he links together social change. I mean, there's the sort of the somewhat archaic kind of theory of human nature, or at least not human nature is perhaps not quite right, but this sort of anthropological, transhistorical sets of imperatives. But they're very tightly woven together with a quite sharp diagnosis of late 19th and early 20th century American society, and truly interesting figure. I don't know whether there was ever a conversation directly between Veblen and Keynes, but it would have been something fascinating.
I was gonna say there seems to me so much overlap in terms of how we've discussed Keynes in the past. In terms of their perspectives on investment and productive investment and how to encourage investment, but Veblen seems to have a perspective that's slightly different when it comes to power and maybe some level of paranoia or maybe realism, depending on your perspective. Taking the university as an example, it almost seems like Veblen has this idea that because there are corporate interests involved in the university, that kind of fundamentally undermines it. And I'm not sure if Keynes would feel that way, or Keynes seems to have this perspective that we've talked about art as well, that I'm not sure Veblen where to find room for that here, because it seems like Veblen is sort of constantly worried about kinds of power intervening in subversive ways. So I don't know, but there is a huge overlap, certainly, it strikes me, with Keynes, but it seems to me they have different temperaments maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the other person would have been Hobson, who would have been an interesting comparison, because Hobson, like Veblen, is deeply preoccupied with imperialism. But no, I take your point that it may be cultural, profound cultural differences in that as you say, Keynes is growing up within this sort of aestheticizing environment of late 19th century Britain. And yes, he does. He drinks the Kool-Aid rather more than Veblen, I think. In some senses, Veblen feels like a more acerbic, fundamentally sociological outsider critic, whereas Keynes really does, I think, believe in the perfectibility of the system in a more, you might say more naive way, but certainly he's less of an outsider than Veblen. It may also to do with the sociology of the two countries, in that Keynes thinks of himself quite reasonably as an heir of a tradition that goes back to Hobbes and Locke, whereas Veblen is trying to make his way in a society that's in such radical flux in this period, is only really consolidating in the course of the late 19th, early 20th century into a more stabilized, coherent society. So, really very, very interesting hypothetical counterfactual.
Well, here's to bringing Veblen back. I was interested. I enjoyed engaging with him. We'll stop the conversation here for now, but we'll continue the mini-series next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us. That's podcast@foreignpolicy.com. Or you can tweet us. That's @OnesAndTwoesPod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.